Welcome back to Silence Serves the Wrong People. I'm Ilja Abbattista, and if this is your first time here, I'm a survivor, a consultant, a trainer, a speaker and a coach, and I work inside the sector that is supposed to be getting this right already. And this podcast exists because there are conversations that really need to happen. Today we are talking about the independent inquiry into the grooming gangs, what it is, what came before it, what it has promised and what it still doesn't know, because I have questions that I intend to keep asking until I get real answers. So let me ask you something about this inquiry. What's going to be different this time? Because we have been here before and we've heard those very words before. Independent inquiry, statutory powers, survivor-centred, trauma-informed, lessons will be learned. No stone will be left unturned. We've heard it all before. And children were still being failed throughout every single process that promised to fix it. So I'm going to ask that question again, and I'm going to keep asking it throughout every single episode we dedicate to this inquiry. And it is not because I'm cynical or because I don't want this to work. It's far from it. But because the people who needed the last inquiry to work are still waiting. And the people who need this one to work cannot afford another cycle of words without consequences. So what is going to be different this time? Let's start with what came before. The Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, IICSA, began in 2015 and it took 7 years. It heard from thousands of witnesses and it made 20 recommendations in its final report in 2022. Now, as of January 2025, which is more than 2 years after the final report was published, not one of those 20 recommendations has been fully implemented. Not a single one. And think about that for a moment. It took 7 years of inquiry, 20 recommendations, and 2 years after the final report, and the system still hadn't done what it was told to do. And throughout all of that, throughout every single hearing, every witness statement, every published finding, children were still being abused. Grooming gangs were still operating. Girls were still being moved, controlled, silenced, and disappeared. And the inquiry didn't stop that, because inquiries don't stop anything on their own. And they only matter if the people with the power to act on their findings actually do. And before the IICSA, there was the panel inquiry that preceded it, which also lost the trust of survivors, which also had resignations, which also had to be replaced. So when this inquiry, the Independent Inquiry into Grooming Gangs, formally began on the 13th of April 2026 with a 3-year timeline and a budget of £65 million, survivors had every right to ask the question that I'm asking now. What is going to be different this time? But before we even get to what this inquiry has promised, we need to talk about what happened before it properly started. Because survivors were already walking out of rooms. In October 2025, 5 survivors resigned from the inquiry's Victims and Survivors Liaison Panel. That's 5 resignations before the inquiry had even formally begun. Fiona Goddard, a survivor of a Bradford grooming gang who has waived her anonymity, described a toxic, fearful environment and condescending and controlling language used towards survivors. She raised concerns about a disturbing conflict of interest in the candidates shortlisted to chair the inquiry, one a former police chief and a social worker, 2 of the professions survivors most associate with being failed and ignored. Eliane Reynolds said she had initially believed that the inquiry would be survivor-led, that it would hold people to account, that real change could follow. And she sat on the panel for 2 days before resigning. Only 2 days. She said the inquiry had become less about the truth and more about a cover-up. And a third survivor, only known as Elizabeth to protect her identity, said the process felt scripted and predetermined, that survivors were being used to legitimize decisions that had already been made. She said, and hear this clearly, that the sense of control and stage management had left many of them questioning whether their voices truly mattered or whether they were just being used. Used. Oh my God, it's that word. How many times do survivors have to use that word before the people running these processes understand what it means? You were not brought into this room because your knowledge matters. You were brought in because your presence makes us look like we're listening. That's tokenism. In the middle of the Grooming Gangs inquiry, the irony is almost unbearable. So both shortlisted chairs withdrew. The inquiry was in chaos before it even asked a single question. And then Baroness Longfield was appointed, and survivors were asked, yet again, to trust the process. So what's going to be different this time? So let's be fair and accurate, because this podcast is always about being factual and fair. There are things about this inquiry that are genuinely different from what came before, which is good. Okay. So Baroness Longfield said in her opening statement, and I listened to it and I really want to believe every single word of it, that where they can, they will publish findings as they go, and not in a single report that turns up years from now. So there's no opportunity for institutions to quietly manage what they find. And she also said that survivors and victims of these crimes and the public will be watching. And she is absolutely right, we will be. And this inquiry has statutory powers, and that means that it can compel witnesses to give evidence under oath. It can require organisations to hand over documents. Institutions cannot simply decline to cooperate the way that they have done before. And I think that is a really meaningful difference. This inquiry will explicitly examine the role of ethnicity, religion, and culture, something previous inquiries were accused of avoiding, and that also matters. And Baroness Longfield herself, a former Children's Commissioner, a long-standing independent advocate for vulnerable children, is a different kind of chair from what was originally proposed. Survivors pushed back on those original candidates, and the process responded. That is also worth acknowledging. So yes, there are differences, real ones, but the terms of reference say all the right things about trauma-informed engagement, about survivors being at the centre, about a victim and survivor charter to be developed, and survivors were already describing a toxic environment and walking out of rooms before those words were even written. So words are not actions and promises are not outcomes, and the distance between what an inquiry says it will do and what survivors actually experience in the room, that distance is where the damage happens. So I ask again, what's going to be different this time? And I want to be very clear about why I can speak about this. I know how these networks operate, and I know that not from reading reports or having read various case files or from academic research or police intelligence, but from inside knowledge as somebody who was there. And I am definitely not going to use this as an opportunity to trauma dump. That is not what this podcast is for. But I am going to tell you what I know because it is operationally important. Grooming gangs do not only have one single method. They do not have just one type of victim, and they are not opportunistic. They are organised, they are calculated, and very adaptive. They identify vulnerability, debt, isolation, no family support, children leaving care with no safety net, girls who have nobody watching out for them, and girls who have already learned that the system does not protect people like them. And those are not random targets, those are deliberate choices. And they use trust as a weapon. So a friend introduces you to somebody, and that someone has a solution to your problem, something that seems manageable, something that doesn't feel dangerous yet. And by the time that you understand what is actually happening, you are already inside it. They plant people to test you, to see if you'll talk, to see who you trust. And if you fail that test, if you say the wrong thing to the wrong person, you find out very quickly what the consequences are. They keep girls moving constantly, never anywhere long enough to become familiar, never long enough to build trust with anybody or anything, never long enough for locals to notice, or long enough for girls to find each other. And it is all very deliberate, because girls who can find each other can corroborate each other too. And girls who know each other's real names can bear witness for each other. So they made sure that we never did. We never knew each other's real names. We never knew where each other came from. And we worked alongside each other and then disappeared from each other's lives without a single trace. Now, I've tried to find some of those girls over the years, but I can't. We are lost to each other, deliberately, by design. And they use fear as the primary control mechanism. Not just the fear of what will happen to you, but also the fear of what you will watch happen to somebody else if you step out of line. And I want to address something that has been used to silence survivors and protect perpetrators for decades. The assumption of promiscuity. The belief that girls who ended up in these situations were there because of their own behaviour, because of how they dressed, how they acted, who they spent time with. The idea that somehow they invited this, that they were willing, that they were asking for it. Now, children are not naturally promiscuous. That is not how children develop. So when a child is presenting with sexualized behavior, when a young person seems to be engaging in a sexual activity beyond what you would expect for their age, the question should never be, what is wrong with her? The question must always be, what happened to her? Because that behavior is a signal. It's almost always a signal that something already has happened, that this child has already been harmed, possibly by somebody else, possibly long before the grooming gang ever found her. And instead of reading that signal correctly, the system labelled her, judged her, dismissed her as promiscuous, as difficult, as making choices. She wasn't making choices, she was surviving. And we are way too quick to label, way too quick to judge, and far too slow to ask the right questions. And that speed of judgment, that unconscious bias, has protected perpetrators and failed children over and over and over again. And we just don't seem to be learning. Trauma-informed practice means understanding that behaviour is communication, that a child showing you something through how she acts is asking you a question that she doesn't have the words for yet. The question is whether the adults in the room are trained enough, curious enough, and humble enough to hear it. They use girls against each other without those girls ever knowing it. Information shared in what felt like a conversation became intelligence for the gang. I gave information that I once had and absolutely no idea that it would be used the way that it was, and it was so awful. And I was not complicit. I was manipulated. And there is a difference, and it is a difference the system has never been good enough at recognizing. They recruit across borders. They move girls across the borders. They operate in networks that cross jurisdictions and don't respect any boundaries of any inquiry. And this inquiry covers England and Wales. That is its legal remit. But grooming gangs are not confined to England and Wales. The networks I witnessed operated across the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. Girls, some of them British nationals, were recruited, moved, controlled, and in some cases disappeared in countries that this inquiry has no jurisdiction over. And those girls are not in the statistics. They are not in the case files. They will not be reached by this inquiry at all. And they may never be reached by any inquiry. And I know this because I was one of them. And I know something else too. There was a girl. I knew her first name, and I was the last person to see her alive. And I know what the people who took her looked like, and nobody, not one person in any official capacity, ever came to ask me what I knew. She was a working girl, so she probably didn't matter. Those are not my words, by the way. But that was the reality. That was what the system communicated every single day to every single girl in that situation. You are invisible, you are unimportant, and what happens to you does not count. And that is silence serving the wrong people in the most devastating way imaginable. So when this inquiry says it wants to hear from survivors, when it says victims and survivors are at the heart of its work, I want to ask directly, which survivors? The ones whose experiences happened on English and Welsh soil? The ones whose cases are already in the system somewhere? The ones that are still alive and traceable and able to come forward? What about the ones who can't be found? And what about the ones who were never counted? And what about the ones whose names nobody knows? What's going to be different for them this time? People always ask why survivors don't come forward, why they don't just go to the police. And I also want to answer that from personal experience, because I had more than one opportunity, and I want to be honest about why I didn't take them. There was a moment that I was taken to a police station. My house had been cuckooed, which means that the gang had taken control of my property without my consent. A practice that is more recognised today, but was completely unnamed back then. A girl had tried to escape the gang. They found her, they brought her to my house, and what they did to her while me and another girl were made to watch was horrendous. She escaped again, and this time went to the police, and I was then picked up. Now, when I was walking down the corridor, I looked through a glass panel that was in the door, and I saw that one of the men connected to my situation was sitting in that very room. Looking directly at me, I did not need to be told what that meant. I did not tell the truth that day because I would be punished the same way as she was, and similar to what I had already experienced. No, thank you. You might call that selfish, but I call that survival. There was another moment where I finally escaped and I could have gone to the police then. And again, I want to be completely honest about why I didn't. The gang had connections to people in very high political positions, and that was not a rumour. That was something that I knew. And when you know that, when you understand who is protected and who isn't, reporting stops feeling like safety and starts feeling like even more danger. And of course, I had watched what happened to girls who escaped and were found, and what was done to them that was horrific. And those images never leave you. And then there were the police themselves. So across the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, police came to various venues where we were working. And not once did any of them ask if we were okay. Not once did they ask if we needed help or if we were safe, or did they even give us any contact numbers on, who to call if we weren't. Their only concern was whether we were illegal immigrants, and that's all we were to them, a paperwork problem. So when the only interactions you have ever had with the police tell you that you do not matter, that your safety is irrelevant, that your humanity is irrelevant, you do not run to them when you finally become free. And these predators went to extraordinary lengths to protect themselves from prosecution. They put the living fear into us deliberately, systematically, and very effectively. They chose girls that the system had already decided didn't matter. And then they used the system's indifference as a part of their control. And that is what this inquiry needs to understand, not just what happened to survivors, but why the systems that were supposed to help us made us feel more afraid instead. I did not fail to report. The system failed to be a place where reporting was safe. Now I want to talk to directly to any survivor who is considering engaging with this inquiry, because there are things you need to know before you make that decision. The inquiry says it wants to hear from you. It says survivors are the heart of its work. It has committed to trauma-informed engagement and support before, during, and after any involvement. Those are the promises. And here is the reality that you need to understand. So most people participate voluntary. However, under the Inquiries Act 2005, the chair can compel a person to give evidence or provide documents if necessary. This is worth knowing before you engage. Witness statements and hearing transcripts may be published. Now, there are protections. Redactions can be made to remove sensitive personal information, and restriction orders can be issued to protect individuals. But survivors who were already involved described feeling exposed, controlled, and unsafe before the inquiry had even properly started. So the question is not just whether protections exist on paper. It is whether you will actually feel protected in practice. And this is critically important. Where the inquiry receives information that raises safeguarding concerns or may relate to criminal activity, it may pass that information to Operation Beacon Port, the national police operation. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. For many survivors, it may be exactly what they want, a chance for their case to finally be looked at. But you need to know that before you decide to engage. Information or informed consent matters. It always has mattered. And too often survivors are put into processes without fully understanding what those processes could mean for them, short-term or long-term. And if you are considering coming forward, please speak to a specialist solicitor first. Please get advice. Understand your rights. Understand what protections are available to you. You deserve to make that decision with full information, not after the fact. And if your experience, like mine, happened outside England and Wales, the inquiry may not be able to reach it at all. Because this inquiry covers England and Wales only, which means there are survivors, British nationals, European nationals, people trafficked across borders whose experiences fall completely outside the scope of every process currently in existence. And I want to say something about how survivors present themselves too, because I do think that this matters enormously. Not all survivors will present in ways that are expected. Some may not be able to hold eye contact. Some may appear flat or emotionless when describing the worst moments of their lives. And some may struggle with timelines or details, and some may seem calm when people expect distress. And some may seem distressed when people expect them to be calm. None of that means that they are lying, and none of that means that they are unreliable, and none of that means that their testimony is worthless. When you factor in trauma responses, what actually happens to the brain and body under extreme stress, these presentations make complete sense. And then when you factor in autism, ADHD, and other neurodivergent profiles, they make even more sense. A person who cannot hold eye contact is not being deceptive. That is just one example of how neurodivergence can be completely misread by a system that wasn't designed with that person in mind. This inquiry has committed to trauma-informed engagement. And I am watching to see whether that commitment extends to genuinely understanding how trauma and neurodivergence present in real people in real rooms. And I'm not talking about the textbook version, but the reality. Because if a survivor is disbelieved because of how they present rather than what they say, that is the system failing them again. And in the middle of the inquiry that was supposed to finally get it right. And boys, let's not forget about the boys, because this doesn't just happen to girls. Boys are victims too. Now, they may be in smaller numbers, but they are still significant numbers. And boys face every barrier that the girls face in coming forward, and then some. Because the system is even less equipped to believe them, support them, or count them. This inquiry must not lose sight of that, and what is going to be different this time for all of them. I listened to Baroness Longfield's opening statement, and I want to be open with you about what that was like, because I didn't listen to it as a commentator. I didn't listen to it as an analyst, but I listened to it as somebody who needed an inquiry like this decades ago, as somebody who was never asked. As somebody who watched a girl disappear and waited for somebody to come and ask me what I knew, and nobody ever came. So when Baroness Longfield said that children who asked for help were too often disbelieved, dismissed, or blamed, I really felt that. And when she said there will be no opportunity for institutions to quietly manage what they find, I really want to believe that. When she said the survivors and victims of these crimes and that the public will be watching, she is absolutely right. We definitely will be. And I hope that this inquiry leaves no stone unturned. I genuinely do. I hope lessons will be learned. I hope that people will be held accountable, real accountability, not managed or quietly resolved, actual consequences for the people and institutions responsible. But most of all, I hope we learn this in such a way that it prevents further exploitation, that the next generation of vulnerable children, the ones that are in care right now, the ones with no safety nets, the ones that gangs are already identifying and targeting, that those children are protected in a way that I was not. In a way that the girls I worked alongside were not. And in a way that the girl whose name that I know was not. And that hope is not naive, it's hard-won. It is held alongside everything I know about how these processes work and how they fail. It is conditional, it comes with demands attached. So publish your findings as you go, and mean it. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. Mean it. Leave no stone unturned. Mean it. And ask the people who actually know how these networks operate, not just the people whose experiences fit neatly within your terms of reference, and not just the ones who are traceable and reachable and already in the system somewhere. Ask the ones you haven't thought to ask yet. Ask the ones whose experiences crossed borders. And ask the ones whose names nobody knows. And ask the ones who have been carrying this intelligence for decades with nowhere to put it. We are here, we are ready, and we have been waiting for a very long time. So what's going to be different this time? I mean, I don't know yet, but I am watching. And I will keep telling you what I see. And this will most definitely not be the last time that we talk about this inquiry, because I will be following it closely. Every hearing, every finding, every moment where survivors are genuinely heard, and every moment where they're not. So we will be reporting back, and if you are a professional, a survivor, or an expert who wants to shape these conversations, whether as a guest on this podcast or by sending information that needs to be heard, my door is open. Because this inquiry belongs to all of us who have been waiting for it. And we will be watching and we will be listening. And this is Silence Serves the Wrong People. And let's hope that we get the news that we are waiting for and that the survivors all deserve.